Okay, we'll get started. So today's our first class venturing into psychodynamic theory. We'll be covering that in the next couple classes. If you've been paying attention in the last couple of lectures with regard to attachment theory, a lot of this stuff should actually feel quite familiar. And the reason being is that, well, you can consider psychodynamic theory as the adult version of what's happening at the level of attachment, or conversely, you can see attachment as being a more narrow focused at that developmental level of everything to do with our familiarity with moods and emotions, habitual ways of relating to people, and ways of coping with less than ideal social environments. So a lot of these themes will carry over into psychodynamic theory. One of the big differences, though, and it's one of the things that we're going to focus on in the next two classes, is this concept of a defense mechanism and how that plays into things and how that will help us make sense of personality structure. So I guess before we get going, does anyone have any sort of residual thoughts or leftover concerns or questions about attachment theory? Yeah.
Can you change your attachment style?
That's one of the really important things that I noticed that I left out or forgot to talk about. Can you change your attachment style? Absolutely. So an individual would be classified as having like an earned secure attachment style if they're able to sort of achieve that. But it's with great difficulty. So it's not something like if you go out and you kind of order on Amazon every single book on attachment and you read all about this stuff, that's not really going to get you any closer to resolving these issues. And the reason is again, there's a big difference between knowing on a conceptual level and what is playing out on more of an intuitive, emotional, tacit, sort of background, just way of existing in the world. And that's where attachment styles are, basically, right? So how do you do that? Well, people can change their attachment styles. There could be like just significant life events that throw them into some situation that challenges some underlying understanding about emotions and relationships and so on. They have like what we call like a corrective emotional experience or a series of corrective emotional experiences. So, the anticipation, for example, of judgment or criticism or being vulnerable, you're going to be perceived as weak or something like that, and you throw yourself into the situation, you find yourself in a situation where you're not judged, you're taken seriously, your emotions matter to someone, you experience yourself, mattering to another person and so on. But usually these sorts of things, like you have to have, many of these experiences to sort of undo a lot of this stuff. And people who move toward like an earned, secure attachment, it's a lot of hard work, and usually it means like being a little bit more aware, attending to like familiar patterns, and then throwing yourself into situations that cause some discomfort, knowing that it's going to be in the end, well, it's safe and it's going to be good for you. So it means moving through some of that anxiety. To develop just different kind of familiar patterns or ways of being with people. Any other questions related to that? Any other general questions about attachment theory that maybe I forgot to speak to? No? Okay, so we'll start with this quote by Sigmund Freud. The conscious mind may be compared to a fountain playing in the sun and falling back into the great subterranean pool of subconscious from which it rises. Now this in a way kind of fits with some of the themes that we've been talking about. So the conscious mind, again, we want to kind of make some minor little corrections perhaps with the language. If we mean by that like in an intentional sense, like that which is available to like a representational mode of comporting ourselves, like we're able to engage in concepts and ideas and beliefs and the self-reflective kind of capacity, that is actually a very narrow range or way of being, and it's predicated on a larger sort of tacit, intuitive way of comporting ourselves in the world and relating to other people. So there's all this sort of background, sort of activity that's happening. when Freud is talking about the unconscious, I would encourage you not to think about that in terms of like a physical entity or a mechanical kind of series of events unfolding in the nervous system. I mean, obviously there's that happening at every single level, but I don't think that that's the right way to really, it's not the right gloss, I don't think. I think you want to, fit that into some of the themes that we've been talking about, this sort of, this background sort of dwelling within a social world and this intuitive sense of, responding to social affordances and dwelling within this sort of referential totality of, significant structures and, familiar kind of habits and all this sort of thing. Like that's kind of what you want to think about in some ways when we're referring to like the unconscious or unconscious sort of aspects of personality. So, as I think you all know, psychodynamic theory, I'll say something in a few minutes about the difference between psychodynamic and psychoanalytic, but just, we'll bookmark that for a moment. Psychoanalysis, as many of you know, was founded or developed by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is a really interesting character. He was born in the mid-1850s and grew up in Austria and spent much of his life working in Vienna. And he was sort of like this child prodigy. He always had this sort of intense work ethic. It was encouraged by his family. His family was quite poor. He wasn't, well off by any means. At the age of 12, he was reading Shakespeare. He was like studying, in his own little room that he had for that sort of thing. And eventually he went off to medical school and he specialized in neurology. Now there's this whole area that was really just wide open for exploration as it related to mental illness. And many of these things were very poorly understood, and particularly what was then called hysteria. Hysteria was a term that was used to describe basically symptoms that a patient would manifest that would appear to have like a neurological kind of component to it. People would experience like paralysis in parts of their body, like they would not be able to have movement in their arm, they wouldn't be able to walk. That didn't seem to, and so these symptoms would manifest, these kind of seemingly neurological symptoms, but there wouldn't be any clear kind of physical cause to interpret this sort of thing. So this was like one of the things that many of Freud's contemporaries were trying to make sense of. It was kind of a mystery and whatnot. And somewhere in his studies, he won a fellowship or an internship or whatever to study in France under Jean-Martin Charcot. And Charcot was a French neurologist who was dabbling in hypnosis. And so in some of these lectures that Freud would watch, Charcot would take a patient who is suffering from apparent hysteria, so that they'd be paralyzed in one side of their body, and he would induce them into a hypnotic state, and through the power of suggestion would encourage them or convince them that their impairment was actually on the opposite side of their body. And so for a brief period in time, they would manifest these symptoms on the opposite side of their body, and then they would regain function in that the side of the body that was thought to be paralyzed. So this seemed to show in a way that in certain cases this wasn't purely a neurological problem, but there was a psychological component to this as well. And Freud was quite taken with this idea and started dabbling in hypnosis himself. He had collaborated with Joseph Breuer, who is a well-known physician in his own right. And Breuer was working with patients that were suffering from hysteria as well. Now, one of the most well-known patients that you guys are probably familiar with from an introductory course is the case of Anna O. That was a pseudonym. Her real name was Bertha Pappenheim, I think it was. And she's actually quite influential in terms of like what psychoanalysis would eventually come to be. So Freud more or less took over that case, and he was working with Bertha, And she discovered that it wasn't so much, the hypnosis that was really helpful to her. So she was suffering from kind of motor problems on one side of her body, this overwhelming anxiety and visual perceptual disturbances and things of that nature. What she found helpful was just being given a space where she could just talk freely, where she could, reflect on just whatever came to mind, distressing, memories or dreams that she might have had, the ability to, re-engage with some of these feelings that she doesn't have a place to experience these feelings in. And this process she referred to as chimney sweeping, right? This is what she called it. And Freud called it free association, right? So just, whatever comes to mind, let's just kind of see where the mind goes and this sort of thing. So she found, some relief from her symptoms, some partial relief anyway. I think when Breuer and Freud stopped working with her, she relapsed and was, I think, institutionalized for a time, and then eventually kind of came out of that and did fairly well. But through these early sort of explorations into the psychological kind of phenomenon, we have the rise of what will become known as the talking cure. So some of the key concepts that we're going to talk about, we're going to be actually, departing from a lot of the Freudian stuff. We're not going to be getting into psychosexual stages and libido and drive theory and all that kind of stuff. We're not really interested in too much of that. I'm not really sure what the value is. I don't really see a whole lot of value in terms of how that sort of thing would come into my own clinical work. But some of the key concepts that we want to focus on here, well, just as a broad definition, psychodynamic theory, the rough translation is dynamic personality. Dynamic in contrast to that which is static or stasis. So with a dynamic understanding of the personality, there's movement, there's flow, there's force, there's energy, there's varying layers or levels. And essentially it acknowledges the importance of unconscious phenomena. So we can think of the unconscious again as that which is non-cognitive, implicit, or pre-thematic ways of being in the world. This may include unresolved or habitually avoided emotions, as well as past experiences and relationships. And all this is important in terms of explaining current functioning. So again, a lot of this should fit quite nicely with some of the things that we've been talking about. Now, just on the term psychodynamic and the difference between psychodynamic and psychoanalytic. So I think this is actually a debatable sort of proposition, but I think one way to look at it is that psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic refers to a particular mode of therapy that was developed by Freud and his followers. So when you think about psychoanalysis, you want to closely tie that to Freud. And so there are specific schools that have developed, psychoanalytic schools that are credentialed, and part of that program is you have to undergo your own psychoanalysis, and eventually you're credentialed as a psychoanalytic therapist. Whereas psychodynamic is more of an all-inclusive, broad umbrella term that basically includes any approach that is including a lot of these things. So an emphasis on sort of unconscious, precognitive processes, the importance of emotions, past experiences, relationship dynamics, and so on. Anything that would fit under that broad, rubric would be considered, roughly speaking, psychodynamic in orientation. I myself would consider myself, roughly speaking, a psychodynamic practitioner. But within that big umbrella, there are all these, competing paradigms and schools of thought. And there may be a lot of big differences between them. Okay. Does that make sense? Yep. So the idea is that personality largely develops out of our interactions with significant others early in life, and it shapes a tacit and familiar way of being attuned through moods, emotions, and our being with others. Interpersonal communication tends to invite, evoke, or pull for responses from others, and we can think of this in terms of relational affordances that are familiar to us based on, a prior understanding, an implicit understanding. So people, again, who have a secure attachment dynamic and they're in the presence of someone that they care about who's manifesting a sad face, that affords the possibility of empathy or comfort and so on. So if one's developmental history is marred by traumatic experiences, neglect, or overwhelming emotion, one may develop tacit modes of coping that can include distorted beliefs and feelings about oneself and what can be expected from others. So it's a restricted mode of being, a restricted way of or even a distorted way of thinking. Usually it's a restricted, receptivity to various moods and emotions, and that colors the way that we interact with others. And again, as we've talked about, this is a way of coping. This is largely adaptive, and it's not something, again, we want to have a healthy dose of respect for that and what that's about. So without being aware, we act as if like a current situation or relational involvement were the same as the one most familiar to us from our past. So again, if we have a secure attachment dynamic where there's an understanding of ourselves as being, roughly speaking, unconditionally worthy or lovable or worth caring about, we have an openness to various moods and emotions. We're confident that we're worth paying attention to or caring for and whatnot. We put ourselves out into the world. We project into the possibility of acceptance and so on. And we trust that if we don't receive that, if we get something other than that, we can either regulate those distressing feelings or we can take a stand and assert ourselves if we need to. A person who grows up in an environment where they're frequently criticized or judged, again, there's this anxiety about similar kinds of experiences, and they're projecting into the possibility of judgment, the possibility of rejection, the possibility of humiliation, and so on. And this, will influence in many ways what eventually happens. So when the other person responds to the pull in communication, a self-fulfilling prophecy occurs. So a person who exhibits confidence, usually good things happen to that person, or it increases the likelihood that good things will happen. If you're doing a presentation and you are focused on the likelihood that this will play out quite well, then you're going to exhibit that confidence, and it will kind of be the self-fulfilling prophecy of a positive outcome. Conversely, a person who's flooded with anxiety and apprehension about judgment and whatnot, they engage with people, they self-censor, they maybe anxiously stutter their words and that sort of thing. And just the cruelty of what it is to be a teenager, like there's a good chance that you might be humiliated or mocked or rejected because of that awkwardness that you exhibit. Transference is a concept that refers to, in a therapy context, when a client repeats with the therapist attitudes and emotional reactions from earlier relationships. So in a sense, these patterns or ways of being or ways of responding gets transferred into the dynamic with the therapist. So, an example of that is again, the client who had been, habitually criticized and judged and, dismissed and so on. They're anticipating or projecting into the therapy dynamic the possibility of judgment. They perceive, or they're ready to perceive, or they're hypervigilant about the possibility of the therapist judging them or criticizing them or thinking them to be ridiculous and so on. And of course the therapist tries to pay attention to what's going on at that level and make use of that. I remember one guy that I was working with, was doing this sort of thing, and I was saying well, look, what is this thing? Like, you're kind of mocking me. You're saying that this is unhelpful. Like, we've only had 4 sessions. You're basically saying that I'm no better than any other therapist that has worked with you. and you're criticizing kind of what I'm doing, or you're waiting for me to somehow give you this miraculous cure. I mean, how do you imagine that to feel on my end? Like when you're mocking me, when you're criticizing me, when you're engaging me in this way, like what do you imagine that to be like for me? And this person kind of stopped for a minute there, and maybe no one has ever kind of called them out on it or drew attention to it. Well, I imagine you'd probably be frustrated or annoyed. Yeah, I am kind of annoyed with you, right? You're annoying me. Now, what part of you would want to annoy me or frustrate me or make me feel irritated with you? Because you're coming here to get help. And yet you come in here and a good part of the session is directed at, attacks directed at me. Now what part of you would want to do that? Would want to sabotage the therapy, like your own therapy, by pushing me away, by making me annoyed and frustrated, right? What is that about? Countertransference is when the client triggers something of the therapist's unresolved emotional past, and the therapist loses objectivity, arguably projecting their own emotional content into the relationship with the client. Or more generally, it could be the therapist's reaction to the client. So just a straightforward example of countertransference. If the therapist, for example, is going through like a really contentious, nasty, divorce, and there's a custody battle, and there's all this resentment and anger toward the spouse and whatnot, or the ex-spouse, and then they go and they work with a client who is on the verge of going through a separation as well, but the therapist is kind of bringing their own resentment and anger into the discussions, or kind of, nudging the conversation along the lines of, well, look, aren't you angry with your ex-spouse, and shouldn't you watch out for this and that? And it's impairing their objectivity, right? And so they haven't resolved or settled their own sort of unconscious issues or emotions as it relates to that separation. An interesting example that happened to me was I was working with this young woman who had a very difficult childhood and was struggling with issues related to negative self-talk and low self-worth, and feeling that just being vulnerable with other people is just a horrifying possibility and whatnot. We did a fair bit of work on that end, but one of the things that she really struggled with was being able to experience anger. So she was always, in a way, in a sense, kind of turning the anger on herself, like, well, it must be my fault, or how stupid of me to trust this person, and blah, blah, blah. And so there's all this sort of self-criticism, but the feeling that would show up that would allow her to direct, or to hold the other person accountable, that feeling never really showed up. So we were working really, really hard for months and months to try to get her, more familiar, acquainted with that feeling of anger. And so we're working really hard in one of these sessions, and we're so close. And we're working with examples, by the way, where any reasonable person would be angry. And so we're trying to nudge that response to see if she can connect with this feeling. And at a certain point in the session, she said, well, I feel something now. And I was like, okay, well, what do you feel inside? What does that feeling want to do? And she said, well, I want to pick up this Kleenex box and throw it at your head. And at this point, I smirked. And, I noticed that I smirked. And now there was a way in which, I could gloss this off and interpret it as like, well, it's a therapy session, and the thought of, throwing Kleenex boxes in therapy, there's something kind of humorous about that. I could brush it off in that way, but that's not what it was, and I knew it wasn't that. So there's something else that was going on within me, that there was a discomfort. So the smirk was anxiety within me about the possibility of my client experiencing this anger toward me, right? And it was unfortunate because it was like the last 10 minutes, and I was still kind of reeling, trying to make sense of what was happening within me and how that was affecting the therapy dynamic and whatnot. But essentially, I went off and did some of my own therapy and self-exploration. I knew roughly what it was. There was just a lot of conflict in my life at that time that I was avoiding, and I was not dealing with very well. And so, the next session, of course, we talked about the smirk, and did you notice the smirk? And I noticed the smirk, and, what happened for you? And did that, kind of, alter like how you experienced that feeling? Like, did it, perhaps kind of shut you down in that moment, or you felt like it wasn't okay to experience that emotion? And so we worked through all of that, and it was quite good. But so again, if you can be aware of this stuff, and you're able to kind of work through it in a way that doesn't negatively affect, the therapy work, then that's a good thing. But more generally, a more general kind of understanding of countertransference is just basically your reaction to a client. And so, you might find yourself, for example, experiencing boredom in the session, right? And you're looking at the clock, or you catch yourself looking at the clock, right? And then you notice, like, my God, am I bored right now? And if you're aware of that, you can use that to try to sort out, well, what's going on? Well, I'm not feeling connected with this client. Well, why am I not feeling connected with this client? Is that something about me? Or is that something about the way that we're relating to one another? And so you can use that to try to, infer what's going on, or try to improve, the therapy outcome. So if one can gain emotional insight, that is, feeling one's way through the relevant unconscious or habitually avoided material while appreciating the proper context within which it belongs, so past relationship, trauma, loss, and so on, one can relieve psychological tension and the need for so-called defense mechanisms. The term defense mechanisms is, I think, worth shaking down a little bit, or kind of wondering, like, well, what do we mean by that, right? So when we talk about a mechanism, it seems to imply a material efficient causal process of some sort, right? And when we think about a mechanistic, if-then relation states, or a spatial temporal unfolding of events and so on. I don't know if that's the right way to look at it, though. I think a way of thinking about it is just how we habitually avoid, or we move away from, different kinds of experiences that are threatening. So the other thing I want to draw attention to here is when we're talking about emotional insight, what that means is that you're able to experience, these emotions that are habitually avoided, or you can viscerally engage with another person in a way that previously had been, threatening in some way. It's not that you have like a conceptual insight, right? You can have the most beautiful interpretation of why you are the way that you are, and it make absolutely perfect sense rationally, analytically. I've worked with countless people that have just, they've gone on Amazon, they've read all the books, they know psychoanalytic, psychodynamic theory inside out, they've read all the attachment books, they can come in, they can say, look, the reason I'm having this issue with, apprehensiveness and anxiety, and I have a hard time, asserting myself and blah, 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 and I think that has to do with my critical mother and my neglectful father and blah. They can put all this stuff together, and they know how it all hangs together conceptually, and still, they're not able to move to that next step. Well, why? Because, again, it's something that has to open up at the level of experience. So I have a diagram over here that roughly lays out a way of thinking about this. So it's almost like there's kind of three layers or three ways of being at work here. So now a person who, again, has this openness to experience, they're able to, when the situation calls for, or when a relationship dynamic invites for an emotional response, they're able to experience sadness, they're able to experience anger, they can feel an appropriate amount of guilt, they can feel empathy for others. There's an openness, right? Now, when a person, is constricted or constrained in a way, one of my clients called this emotional constipation, which I think is quite apt. But the emotion doesn't show up, and so the emotion is, or that way of being, is intuited by the body as a threat to our equilibrium or homeostasis. And so the emotion as a situation or as a relational affordance or dynamic pulls for or invites for the emotion to show up, for it to be experienced. What happens instead, rather than the feeling showing up, the person experiences anxiety. And the anxiety can show up in, as we talked about, a number of different ways. It can show up as, that sympathetic kind of fight or flight type anxiety, or it can be a parasympathetic freeze response, but there's anxiety. And anxiety it doesn't even have to be, much of the time it's operating at a level that we don't even notice, right? You might say, well, how do you not notice? A subtle tension in your chest, right? Your hands becoming, a bit moist with sweat. You're, fidgeting with your hands. You're sighing, right? So many of these things operate on a level that we are just not even tuned into. We're attending from our body to the situation, right? And what's happening in the body is in the background. So we have emotion, anxiety shows up, and the body just naturally wants to move away from anything that is causing distress, right? Anxiety is just uncomfortable, right? If there was a chair that you sat in for whatever reason, it caused some mild discomfort, another one didn't, you'd find yourself sitting in the other chair and you wouldn't know why, right? This is what happened. Why do you like this chair? I don't know, I just prefer this chair. So there's emotion, anxiety, and then avoidance. And the avoidance is, they're the ways that we settle the anxiety and the threatening emotion that would come up if we were to approach it directly. And this is effectively what the defense mechanism is, the various ways that we avoid or settle the anxiety that would otherwise come up. So again, we have to go beyond mere interpretation. So if you're working in this way, so if it makes sense to work with a client in this way, then what you're doing is you're trying to help the client notice. You're being really attentive, and anyone who's wanting to do clinical work, I would say, like, you have, even if you think that psychodynamic theory is hooey and whatever, man, like, take some coursework in some of the short-term dynamic approaches, because they're just like so tuned into like subtle little signs of avoidance that I think many of the more cognitively oriented approaches, they're not really dialed in with that fine-tuned lens. But so the therapist would notice possible signs of avoidance, and they would help the client become aware of this avoidance and invite them to re-engage with some part of their experience. Now, what's going to happen if you, in a way, block the avoidance or you encourage the client to disengage from this avoidance pattern? What's going to happen? They're going to become uncomfortable, right? And, if you're working with a client in this way, nothing therapeutic is going to happen if the client is not experiencing some level of discomfort, right? Like, good therapy should be like uncomfortable, because it's kind of challenging you to move experientially from a place that is familiar and comfortable to a state or a way of being that is novel or opens up in a different way. So there's avoidance, there's anxiety, and so the anxiety, I think you guys know this, right? Like, when you move away from the anxiety, you kind of reinforce the anxiety, right? So it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't habituate. It doesn't decrease or anything like that. So when you block the avoidance, you encourage the client to hang out in the anxiety. After a while, the anxiety starts to subside. You engage in anxiety regulating sort of strategies or whatever to bring the anxiety down, but you're continually trying to push into the emotional component or the relational part of what's at play here. And when that happens, then the anxiety, the wall of anxiety, in a way, it just breaks. It just gives way, and it gives way to the emotional experience. Anyone have any questions about that? Does that make sense? Yeah. So another way of putting this is, So the person is faced with psychological or physical stressors that cannot be easily overcome or resolved. You can think about this in terms of the attachment styles or dynamics. The person may experience this in the form of overwhelming emotion or anxiety, or the possibility of overwhelming emotion or anxiety. Prolonged stress or anxiety is uncomfortable and a threat to day-to-day functioning. Without being aware, we engage in modes of comportment that distance ourselves from the experience of anxiety and or the overwhelming emotion. And this is, in essence, the defense mechanism. That's what it is. I'm not going to go over that slide. So defense mechanisms are unconscious mechanisms. Again, I don't think we want to construe that in the efficient causal sense. To defend the ego or the self or our personality in the face of anxiety. Two main characteristics of a defense mechanism is that they're denials or distortions of some aspect of reality or some aspect of what would be, your experience, and they operate unconsciously or without being aware of it. So it's a process that's playing out in the tacit sort of background way of comporting ourselves in the world. So I'm going to show you guys a video. This is actually a little clip from a really cool series on Sigmund Freud. It's a BBC series, a 6-part series. And in this clip, he's working with a patient who is suffering from conversion-type symptoms. And you can kind of see how some of this stuff plays out.
Tell me once more about the last days of Gestein. Before you heard your sister was dying, the day you took a walk around the lake.
Why do you always come back to that?
Because you always resist it. I know. It's been a tiring interview. Be strong, just a little longer. You'd taken that walk before, with your brother-in-law.
And on other occasions. The three of us. You may smoke, Dr. Freud, I don't mind. And I know you're longing to.
Thank you. But this time, on the walk alone, you were dreaming about marriage?
Thinking about it, yes.
An unusual train of thought?
For me? Not really. I've never met anyone appropriate, that's all. And that day it was no more than natural to think about it. When you see someone as happy as my sister was.
And when you're so unhappy yourself. So you sat down to rest. And the pains began. What were you thinking when the pains came on? Can you remember?
I don't know.
Try.
Probably. How unfair it was for a person's good fortune to be threatened by their very happiness. I mean, Dolphy having a second baby so soon after the first one. We were all anxious about it.
So when you got home, you took a bath to ease the pain. And at first it was soothing, the cramps relaxed. And then suddenly they came on again, this time for good.
Oh.
Why?
Oh.
What gave rise to it this time? Think. Look at me. Remember how it was. You're in the bathhouse, in the warm water, lying at ease, thinking about the day. About the walk you took. About Adolphine and her baby. In the warm water, free from pain. Listen to me.
No.
Fräulein von Riedberg, must I repeat, if I'm to help you...
How? How is it helping? If the pains are getting worse this very moment?
Why do you suppose that is? You tell me.
Because you're tormenting me. Don't you understand how much I loved my sister?
I do. Believe me. Is it love that's causing you such pain? Come, lie back on the couch a moment. Then put your head back where I can reach it. Rest it back. And when I press against your forehead, you will try to clear your mind. Clear it of all other thoughts. And think back to that afternoon. What can you remember when I press? Hard. Something now. The memory's coming.
Only that I thought about my cousins while I was lying in the bath. And my Aunt Gisela.
Why about them?
They stayed in the rooms above when they came to visit.
And nothing else? What are you thinking of now?
My mind was elsewhere.
Yes.
You could tell.
Just answer me. What are you thinking of?
The garden house.
The garden house?
At Reichner. Where Dolphy died. And I was so upset. He wasn't there to meet us at the station.
Your brother-in-law? Why were you so upset?
That was when I knew. I thought I couldn't move another step. I'd seen it in his face. Beside the lake. How worried he was. And when they left for Reichner, he looked at me to warn me that it would never be the same. That it was the end. And then the telegram. On the journey. In silence. And when he wasn't there, I was so afraid it was too late. That it had all come true. That she was lying there. And he was all alone with her. And she was dead. Oh, help me!
Fräulein von Riedberg, don't you know that you're in love with your brother-in-law?
No! Oh, no!
Don't stop
no.
now!
No, how could you say such a thing?
Look at me!
Oh.
Remember when you arrived at last, when you came into the garden house, into her bedroom, and you saw her, you thought...
I thought, what did I think?
Tell me!
I thought now he's free again and I can be his wife. Is that what you want to hear?
Is it the truth?
If it were the truth, why would I hide it from you?
For the same reason you hide it from yourself.
Do you think me so wicked?
Is it wicked to have emotions? To be attracted to someone? Even a brother-in-law?
It isn't true.
Your words, you told me so yourself. You longed to be his wife. Is that so terrible?
You think me without shame, then?
On the contrary. Why do you think you've fallen ill? Because you are ashamed. And the force of your illness is no less than the force of your moral will. You may take it as a tribute if you wish, to fend off immoral thoughts. See, the mind refuses them, but the body has no conscience. Thankfully. Or we should never suspect what others sometimes struggle to endure. I've known for months.
Will you tell Dr. Breuer what I said today?
Not if you don't want me to. He is your doctor too, of course, and as such, shoulders the same responsibilities as I do. Are you afraid he'll speak to your family about it? I can assure you.
I'll say you talked me into it. Well, it's true, you did.
Tell me something. Where do you feel pain now?
Here. In the thigh. A little.
Only a little? Come, stand up, please. You see, remember, what is said in this room is our concern and no one else's. No matter how deeply we delve. Confessions, fantasies, denials, they're all alike. In this room, you must cease to be afraid. And please be honest with yourself. Today, we breached the defenses.
You think so?
And next time, we'll ease that little pain that's left. You'll see, our victory will be complete. You doubt me?
Why pretend? There are some things that can't be changed.
Some things never.
Circumstances. And people's lives. The misery it brings, you admit yourself, that can't be changed.
But isn't it a kind of progress, don't you think? If, between us, we can transform this misery into common unhappiness.
It's an interesting clip, yeah. Bit dramatic, but it does highlight some of these principles and probably presents Freud in maybe a different way than you might have in mind just through reading some of the introductory personality texts. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts or comments about the clip? Anything kind of surprise you or kind of stand out as significant or interesting? Yeah.
It was interesting how it kind of moved through.
So this is what we would now call conversion type symptoms. So they're physical symptoms that seem to have like a psychological cause. Don't ask me how that works. I don't know if anyone really knows how that works. It is a thing. But it essentially, the physical symptoms in a way are kind of manifesting sort of in the way that anxiety would, right? And so when you're working with people that somatize, what can happen is that as you approach some distressing thought or feeling, they will report having like tension headaches like in the session, right? If there are people that somatize in that way. Yeah.
Is that kind of similar with like people who, they say people are stressed, they're more likely to get sick, like when you're stressed, your immune system's low?
Well, I think that's maybe a little bit different. I mean, everyone endures a certain amount of just stress, but here we're more specifically talking about like stress or anxiety or tension as it relates to like a threatening experience or the possibility of a threatening emotion or something like that. Yeah. Any other comments or thoughts about anything in there? I thought it was interesting. What did you think about his comment, like, I've known for months? Right? That's a pretty bold claim, you know, but what do you think he meant by that? How could he have known for months?
I don't think he knew. I think he was just saying that to show that, like, I care about you despite your flaws.
Right.
So she can feel safe to continue on, like, and not have to worry about judgment.
Now, I'm kind of fascinated by this sort of thing myself, and I don't know how to quite make sense of it. But could we argue, though, that there is a way in which we could say maybe he did know for months? And if so, how would we justify that position?
I think, well, he's obviously always brought up.
Right.
multiple times.
And what was his response? Do you remember? Why do you always bring this up?
Because you, it was something. Yeah, because you always avoid it.
That's right, yeah. So one of the criticisms of, we'll get into this later, but one of the criticisms of the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic approach is that it's all, you know, nothing but armchair theorizing. It's all kind of making these lofty interpretations tied to early experiences. It's all the mother's fault, like all this kind of stuff, right? It's presented as if it's something that is unscientific. I would challenge that, and you know, so this claim that you could know for months. Now, I would say I would qualify that. I don't think you can know for months, but you can deeply suspect for months. And how could you deeply suspect? Well, you're testing a hypothesis in working in this way, right? You're testing a hypothesis. Well, maybe there's something connected here to, the death of the sister, or maybe there's some feelings that this person has for the brother-in-law. And so how would you test that? Well, you test it, and so repressed feelings, right? So you test that by asking questions, and what comes of it. Well, if you see a bunch of avoidance showing up, then it might, kind of offer a little bit of confirmation of that hypothesis. Now, you might, draw attention to that or nudge it a little bit further. And if what starts to show up is anxiety, rather than a feeling, right? So if the person, for example, said like, oh gosh, why do you bring that up? Yes, I had feelings for my brother-in-law, and oh, I feel so guilty about it. Like if they expressed in that way, then there's nothing there, right? There's like, they're acknowledging a feeling that they had or have or whatever, and there's no way in which that is likely tied into their symptoms. But if you ask those questions and instead anxiety starts showing up, then it's positive evidence of your hypothesis. So in working from this angle, like a therapist is looking for possible avoidance, and they're looking for anxiety. So anxiety is almost like a metal detector that you're kind of using, and you're just kind of fumbling around in questions and just kind of seeing what sets it off, and then seeing if there's something relevant there. But this question of, could someone know for months? I don't think you could know for certain, but I think you could have, some pretty strong intuitions about it. So this is sort of a lengthy bit that I was going to go through, so I think I'm going to hang out here for a minute. One of the other things, I guess, how would this approach, we can get into this, again, maybe in the next class, but how would this approach, how does it differ from, your understanding of like a straightforward second wave, like CBT type approach? So we have someone who's showing up, let's say, with chronic anxiety, right? how would like a CBT type practitioner maybe approach that? How would they approach it differently? Would they approach it differently? Maybe they wouldn't, I don't know. Anxiety, I think, like from more of a second wave CBT type approach, is typically interpreted as the product of how the individual interprets their environment, or how they frame it, how they conceptualize it, specific kind of beliefs or automatic thoughts or something like that. So I think the cognitive behavioral practitioner, at least in the traditional sense, they would be more after like the conceptual content that may somehow give rise to some anxious disposition or something like that. So in other words, the goal is to settle the anxiety, right? To reduce it. Whereas the goal of the psychodynamic theorist is quite different. Like the goal is actually to momentarily increase the anxiety because you're trying to push through it into something that is connected to the anxiety or beneath the anxiety. Or it opens up a novel experiential possibilities, to the individual who's constricted in this way. Now that doesn't mean that a cognitive behavioral therapist can't work, intensely with emotions, but my sense is that they are probably not working as intensely as someone who has more dynamic training. For example, I'm not aware of within the cognitive behavioral literature, I don't think they emphasize anything like defense mechanisms, or I don't think they have a comparable concept that they put at the forefront of their theory. Certainly they would speak about cognitive avoidance and things like that, but I don't think it ties together in this experiential way, in the sense that that is expressed through the dynamic theorists. So, another, I guess this would be like a more of a critique of some of the cognitive approaches, particularly, again, the second wave. They're trying to improve on some of the stuff and reintegrate into the body and experience and introducing mindfulness and this sort of thing. But one of the critiques from a psychodynamic perspective of more of a cognitive approach is that you're just teaching the person how to intellectualize, right? How to engage in, a conceptual mode of being that allows them, affords them some distance from the experience. And of course, you're going to get a settling of emotion and anxiety when you do that, but you're actually not addressing, arguably, the core issues with this person. You're just essentially putting a Band-Aid on it, Now, again, I hope that the newer third wave approaches are trying to correct for some of this stuff, but I think that would be a reasonable criticism. Yep.
So with the CBD critique, would that be kind of similar to like the hypercognitivize, where
Yeah, exactly.
thinking about more than you feel?
That's right. Yep. Yep. And again, it's interesting, like when you think about but it's an empirically supported treatment. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that you kind of randomize, the treatments, supportive therapy, CBT, whatever, and CBT, has improvements in symptoms and whatnot. Well, again, you can teach someone how to intellectualize, and you're going to get that. But it doesn't mean that they're thriving individuals. It just means that they're coping, better than they were. Yeah. Any questions about any of that? Okay, well, I think I'll wrap up there, just to not get into this next little section, and we'll see you guys back here on Thursday. Office hours after class, if you want to drop by.